Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. I'm still in the desert and dealing with less than ideal equipment, so I appreciate your patience with sound quality. As always, please rate, review, and tell fellow solos about the podcast. If you want to get an email about forthcoming live Zoom calls, please sign up on the Solo podcast page at petermcgraw.org. I appreciate your support. In this episode, I speak to an asexuality activist about what it means to be asexual. We discuss the prevalence of asexuality in the population, as well as our shared perspective about the importance of being connected to a wide array of people. If you stick around to the end, we recap by defining terms that are often overlooked when talking about people's sexual and romantic preferences. I hope you enjoy the episode. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is David J. David is the founder of Asexuality.org, an asexual activist. He's been featured in the documentary Asexual. He's helped lead the team which fought to delist asexuality as a mental disorder, and he currently chairs the board at Asexuality.org. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to get to talk about this topic.
This is great. So, David, I'd like you to start, if you don't mind, by defining asexuality and telling us how you got here. Why have I found you, of all people, to talk about this topic?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, I have to say. So, an asexual person like me is someone who experiences little or no sexual attraction. So, I still have a desire to form close emotional relationships, just not to make sexuality a part of them. There's a bunch of different ways that asexuality shows up. Some people are still have really strong romantic attraction. They might identify as homo-romantic or hetero-romantic because they still date people. They still want kind of a romantic long-term partnership. I, along with a lot of asexual people, identify as aromantic. So I tend to form really close, committed friendships, you could say. I would call them aromantic partnerships, rather than romantic relationships. And sometimes they'll involve cuddling and things, but I'm not really compelled to have them involve sexuality. And so there's this strange way in which I'm both kind of very signal and have always been, or very solo and have always been solo. And that I've had maybe one serious romantic relationship. Also a way in which I've never been solo, because kind of, to me, all of my relationships count. Like I've had a life of really figuring out how to be surrounded by all of these incredible, powerful forms of intimacy. And so I think I'll get to this in a second. I, like many, ace is sort of a slang term for asexual. I, like many ace people, have sort of struggled with this fear of being alone for my life. This fear that kind of I'm destined to never get in a real relationship, and this sense of liberation of looking around me and saying, like, look, I'm surrounded by real relationships. I'm surrounded by powerful relationships, and how do I name that and make them more powerful?
Yeah, so we'll get back into how I tracked you down, but a couple quick observations is I believe that naming things is important. It's one of the few things I feel like I've done well in my life. So I named my humor research lab HURL as the acronym, right? It's got me a lot of usefulness in the world of media. Obviously, I pondered a lot over the title of this podcast. I think Solo is well named. I love the idea of ACE. You know, it's a positive term, you know, and it does have a slight singleness, connotation, but only slight, I think. But it's positive. It's but I wanted to talk to someone about asexuality because of its potential connection to singleness. But I think that there's an inkling in one of the sort of principles or ideas that I have between living a remarkable life that you embodied, which is the importance of being interconnected. That I often talk about having a team, a group of sort of professional and personal connections to help you live life at its best. And I came across one of your talks, and I'll put it in the exhibits. And in that talk, you start with this dyad. You have this sort of dyad of some person, David, who might be connected kind of romantically or sexually to some other person potentially. That seems to be like the kind of most important relationship structure kind of in the world. It's like the status quo, it's the norm, and so on. And then what you do in this talk, which I liked a lot, was you started to add dots and add connections to these other relationships that aren't romantic necessarily or aren't sexual necessarily. That I think the average person might call them a friend, and in it, I think you tell a story. You can remind me if I'm telling this correctly, about how you sat down with one of these sort of friends to kind of talk about the relationship. What does it mean? Defining it, the DTR, so to speak.
Yeah.
I'm being cheeky, but that's sort of the way I've heard it.
Yeah, and this is a real journey that I went on. So I think one of the things you were alluding to about the story of why you're talking to me, that I'll shoehorn into this story about, I think, how I learned to do intentional intimacy.
Okay.
So I not only identify as asexual, I founded a website called asexuality.org, which has sort of become the gathering place. I think you said this in my intro, like become the gathering place for ace people. And I remember, and I should go ahead and say that ace also doesn't just refer to asexual people. There are people who are identify as gray on a spectrum between sexual and asexual. There's people who identify as demisexual. They experience sexual attraction only when they have a really close emotional connection to someone. So like they can't be sexually attracted to someone on a first date. There's a whole spectrum of identity, and ace is kind of an umbrella term.
I see.
For those. So I remember being in my kind of early 20s, right as I was in college, getting out of college. The ace community was really young at that point. It was like a few thousand people. We were getting together on a website. We were just like realizing that we weren't alone for the first time, which was really powerful, and starting to talk to one another. And one of the things we talked about the most was intimacy, was what it means to form relationships, because most of us, like me, had this real desire to be connecting deeply and powerful with other people. And most of us, like me, saw that dating was the script for doing that. Like if you wanted a relationship that, when people said, are you in a relationship with someone, they meant, are you playing out this very specific script of what a relationship can look like? And that relationship involves sexuality, it involves emotional intimacy, it involves commitment. But like all of those things are sort of part of this one package. And it was a package that we didn't have access to.
Can I interrupt for a second? So please. I have this saying with my friends, I call it, this is the sort of more mundane way that I say is that it's the genital heart connection.
Yes.
And so I have a friend who she meets some guy, she's attracted to him, she has a certain type that she likes, and the sex is great, and then she starts to get feelings for him, even though she, at the very beginning, if you said, oh, is he a good partner for you? Would he be a good boyfriend? What do you think? She'd be like, no, I just want to roll in the hay. But because she starts having sex with him, they start spending more time together, these feelings start to develop. So I recognize that even when it's not a set out path that you want to build intimacy with someone, that sex can be a kind of easy way, or it's like not for everyone obviously, but it can often happen. And so if you're in a world where you're not inclined to be intimate with someone sexually, then that may preclude some of those types of connections, good or bad.
Yeah, and I think that the thing for me was, it was never like, oh, those connections aren't valid, because like I think it's great that people have sex, that they enjoy having sex. Like I'm as many aces are, like I'm a sex positive person. For people who want it, right? I think for me it was like I like to dance, right? I like partner dancing. If I meet someone on the dance floor and we have a really good connection on the dance floor, and then after the dance we start talking and we realize we have a lot in common, that connection is not seen as sacred and reified and powerful in the same way as if we'd done a different thing with our bodies.
Yes, right.
And had great conversation. And so it's not that like I want the sex to be less intimate or less powerful, and sex that doesn't result in intimate relationships is great too. But
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's that all the other kinds of intimacy feel like they're kind of smudged out. They're not seen. They're not celebrated. They're not recognized. And I think that was the thing that I was really struggling with, was saying like, okay, if I'm not following this script, for creating a capital R relationship, then how do I still get 98% of the things on that script that I want, right? Like I still want touch with people. I still want deep emotional connection. I still want trust. I still, and I'll get to this in the future, I still really wanted to have kids. And now I'm in a place where I do have a kid that I'm co-raising with some aromantic partners of mine. In maybe a non-solo, I don't know how that qualifies me, but we don't have to.
Yeah, you don't have to be solo to be a guest. You don't have to be a solo to be a listener. I think this is it's a big tent.
But it's I remember sort of spending a lot of time thinking about this script and saying, how do I when my friends have a romantic partner, they talk about the relationship. They talk about where it's headed. They talk about what they want out of it. There's this sense that there's a path. Like if the relationship persists, there's a path that needs to follow that leads somewhere, or the relationship isn't worth doing. And whereas my friendships, I would kind of show up and we'd have amazing, like we'd have time together that was incredible. We'd feel strong things about one another. And there was just this sense that you kind of keep doing that. Like you keep doing that for as long as it's convenient to keep doing that. And then you stop. And I wanted something in between, like something that didn't have that sense of inevitable progress to a destination, but that still could have that degree of intentionality. And when I was in my 20s, I think me and plenty of other ACE people did this. ACE people aren't the only people who do this, but I really started, like my practice of intimacy became finding people I was friends with, and after about a year, usually of that becoming a really important part of one another's lives, giving them a heads up like 2 weeks in advance and saying, this relationship, my connection with you has become an important part of my life. I would like to have a long conversation about what this connection means to both of us. And it's not because I want to date you. It's not because I'm secretly in love with you and secretly want the script that we're not doing, because I don't want the script. It's that you matter to me, and I would like to just share the experience of how we matter to one another.
I see.
And those conversations, some people were knocked down. Some people were really intimidated by that because they were only used to doing that romantic relationships, and their brains couldn't process the emotion of that kind of relationship in this sort of a context. But some people really, really liked it. And I found that we would sort of go on these long walks. We would just basically name what we were already doing together that we liked.
Yeah, that's great.
Like, where did we fit in kind of the ecology of one another's lives? And then coming out of those conversations, we were able to commit to doing the things that worked more. So if we just like happen to hang out every Monday to, have a conversation, we'd be like, okay, now that's a ritual. Like now we are committing to hang out every Monday. And if something changes in our lives, we're going to talk about it. And yeah.
Oh yeah, that's great. I have so many thoughts going through my head, but the two quick ones is I can see, besides the fact that it's sort of off script, I think that there is something that's sort of parallel to that DTR, as I'd like to joke about, that define the relationship talk, is how intimidating that is.
Yeah.
Because what you do when you have your DTR, or as you call it, so, you have this intentional intimacy talk, is you're in some ways asking for what you want. There's some chance of rejection. There's some chance of incompatibility there.
Yeah.
And that's scary to people, right? So it's like, so then you end up in these don't ask, don't tell relationships, where you're just sort of acting on behavior, there's never any sort of conversation about it. That's my first reaction. The second one is, this is something that I'm super aware of with my non-intimate relationships, whether it be with women friends who were not romantic or sexually intimate, and my guy friends, I'm heterosexual, where lately especially I have, with my male friends especially, have been working to tell them that I love them, to explicitly say, I love you. And because that's something that men don't do very well.
Yeah.
And even using language like brother that expresses that, as like a sort of, connection that helps say, like, no, you are very important to me, in that sense. And luckily I attract the kind of friends who are comfortable with that and appreciative of it, and often respond in turn. There's no expectation of that, of course, but I appreciate how thoughtful you were in your 20s when you were doing this. Yes.
Yeah. Well, when I started figuring it out, I think, and part of that was because I didn't have another choice. Like, I think like a lot of other aces, it was like this, or I'm kind of left in the dust when all my friends form romantic relationships.
Yeah, it's always scary, and it's always, it's always concern where you have a good friend, they meet someone, and then they disappear, and you kind of joke, they'll be back when the breakup happens, or the divorce happens, or whatever that might happen there. And I've always worked very hard to, when I do have a steady relationship, to not have that happen, because I've so often been on the other side of it. But I could see how it could be even more threatening if you're like thinking, well, this may not happen to me, right? Some sort
of. Like I don't have that. I don't have access to the thing that my friend is doing in this moment. Yeah, and I think there was a really powerful moment for me when I started figuring out how to have these conversations. There was a lesbian woman who I'd become very close with, and we became intentional. She's currently, she asked me to be the god parent of her child. So we're still really close.
Is she in the documentary?
Yeah, she is, Puno.
Okay. I watched the documentary. I thought it was good. Really good.
Yeah, it's great. It's on Amazon now, I think.
That's good. That's great.
But
the reason it was so good is just so different. We're just not having this conversation. And yet, I'll get back to about your friend, and yet ACEs are a surprisingly large percentage of people.
Yeah, and quick aside on that, we've had, so the best research we've had was a study done in the UK that shows about 1%. We've had some, like a survey of incoming students within the University of California system that have shown even higher than that. But it really varies, because I think the number of people who don't experience sexual attraction and the number of people who use the word asexual to identify are really different.
Yes.
And so it becomes, depending on how you count and how you think about it, you wind up with different numbers. But
even 1% is a large number.
Yeah.
And then if you think about how easy it is for that number to get bigger, for example, someone may not be asexual through their entire adult development, right? So there's sort of circumstantial, contextual effects and so on. Yeah.
And I think that within the ACE community, that's a thing that's been really important to us, is that it's not like, this is not a kind of scratch and sniff label. It's not like you rub it off and then either you're like truly asexual or truly not. And like, this is about, we grew up in a society that told us that we were going to be alone forever, that told us to be ashamed because we weren't forming relationships according to the script. And we pushed back against that and said, look, we think part of sexual liberation is recognizing that some people are interested in sexuality and can be intimate however we want or don't want, regardless of that. And so that discussion where we say, look, being really sexual isn't something people should be ashamed about. Being really not sexual isn't something that people should be ashamed about. If someone shifts from, over the course of their life, from being really sexual to not being really sexual, they shouldn't feel like they're failing at intimacy and failing at sexuality. They should be like, cool, my body wants a different kind of intimacy right now. Let me explore and learn how that works for me, and like enjoy that just as much as I was enjoying the sex. Whereas right now, I think there's this sense that if you are not kind of hypersexual, like not hypersexual. I think there's a lot of shame put on hypersexuality. There's a sense that like if you're not forming a particular kind of sexuality, you are failing in intimacy, and there's a lot of shame associated with that.
Yeah, there's like people say having a healthy libido, right? Like by using the term healthy, it suggests that there's some correct level of libido. You go too high, that's a problem. You go too low, that's a problem. I obviously the connection to this. First of all, I think this is a really under talked about and understudied topic, but I also think that one of the things that I think is in parallel to sort of just solo living in general and having a positive view of solo living and having a positive view of asexuality is like even the fact that you have to think about it or talk about it that way, because there's this sort of norm, this large group of people, there's this sort of perspective that pervades the media, that is a focus of government, a focus of education, a focus of science, and so on. And then when you deviate from it, the natural question is, well, what's wrong with you? And, oh, that'll change. And even at the very least, a bit of like curiosity that doesn't always feel good that's there. And so even if it may be sort of well-intentioned, but just because it's stepping away from what is so common.
And this is part of why, for me, for a lot of the ACE community, we see ourselves as very tied up in queerness. Like many of us identify with the queer community, we identify and sort of show up for queer struggles because there's a similar kind of structure of, there's a system of shame that says if you're not normal in how you do relationship, intimacy, and gender, there's something wrong with you, and you need to be ashamed, you need to be corrected. And that doesn't just impact queer people, that impacts everyone. But that's what I think of when I hear you talking about that.
It's something I haven't articulated yet, but I have thought about it, is that when I think about single people living remarkable lives, it's often the gay and lesbian community that I feel like has this much better figured out in some ways than heterosexuals. In part because marriage wasn't an option for a long time, and still isn't in some places, and I don't know. There's sort of a little bit more, and also even the notion of pride. I don't know. It's just something that I haven't thought completely through. But in some ways, when I think about remarkable singles, there are oftentimes disproportionately gay or lesbian.
There's a metaphor. This is a little bit hazardous. If you want to, like, sometimes when I form new relationships with people, they're people, it's like the people who always go to a restaurant. Like they're sort of like, okay, I'm used to looking at a menu, there being a certain set of choices, and I choose the kind of relationship I want, and then that's what I get. And so we're sitting down, they're like, okay, what kind of relationship are we going to have? What, like, from the menu? And there's some people when I form relationships with them where they're used to cooking. They're like, okay, like, we want a relationship. Like, what do you want it to taste like? Like, we'll take some of this ingredient, we'll put them together this way. Like, they have that skill set.
I see.
And I find that, like, I know many straight people who deeply have that skill set, but I know almost no queer people who don't have it.
I see. That's fascinating.
Because you're you're sort of forced to.
Yeah, and I certainly, to me, this is not a project that's designed to couple people up. You know what I mean? So a lot of single-focused resources, books, and almost every other podcast I've come across that is focused on singles is really about either what's wrong with you, you need to stop being in this state, and we're going to help you get there. You know what I mean? Get there. Versus this is completely acceptable, as I say, for now or forever, in that sense. So I could see why that affiliation with the queer community would work so well for the reasons that we're talking about. I had interrupted you before. You were telling a story about...
this is coming back to that story about Poonam. We were talking about sort of this practice of intentionality and
Yes.
and the experience of kind of getting like having a non-romantic relationship that is sort of left to the side when a romantic relationship happens.
Mm-hmm.
And there's almost this expectation that like you should be happy for your friend, you should like graciously step to the side and make space for this more important relationship. And I part of me I don't deeply disagree with that. I think that like I want the people in my life to have the relationships that they want to be happy. I don't want to stand in the way of other people's connection and intimacy. But I remember with this friend who I kind of had an intentional conversation with, it was the first time someone got into a new relationship with a new partner where they were like full of new relationship energy and sat me down and said, look, have this new relationship. Let's talk about what that means for our friendship.
Okay.
Like, let's basically plan out how to be in integrity while I go through this instead of just kind of piecing out. And that was a huge moment of transition for me because it felt like that was a moment of my relationship mattering, my relationships that were romantic, that weren't sexual, that weren't part of the script, like being able to be intentionally talked about in the same way that these romantic ones were. And I think that as I got, richer in my own skill of doing intimacy that way, I was able to learn a lot more about how to balance the romantic relationships in people's lives, the sexual relationships in people's lives, none of which do everything. Like there's no romantic or sexual relationship that does everything. Mm-hmm. There's always space. And I was able to kind of figure out how to complement the relationships in people's lives in a way that also met my needs, that also met the needs of other people, and got really good at kind of like triangulating. Almost like I'd meet one person, they'd have a partner who was also really cool. I'd then become friends with their partner, and that wound up becoming a really stable arrangement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think by the way, I mean, I sort of love this model. I mean, the fact that you're so intentional about it. I mean, I've always kind of done it, not as explicitly in terms of talking to people about it, but when I was younger, I was kind of a late bloomer when it came to relationships. I wanted to fall in love and I wanted to have sex and I wanted those things, and I just wasn't good at it. As a lot of young men tend to not be good at it. And then even when I got better at it, I always knew I wasn't on track to, be married with children deep down. You know what I mean? You gave me a lie detector test. It never was something that I really, really wanted. And then as I got into my late 30s, then I was like, I don't want kids. And then once you don't want kids, then marriage seems often superfluous, so on. But what I always did, and especially because I had some family challenges, I was really off on my own a lot. I didn't have much of a cushion. I didn't have a financial cushion. I didn't really have a place that I have a friend who, like, the pandemic hit, he moved back in his parents' basement as a 40-year-old, like that just never was a possibility for me. And so I always leaned so heavily on my friendships. Like I took a lot, I gave a lot, I held these people up to a very high standard. I held myself to that high standard. And so I thought about it a lot, like the figure that you had in your talk, which is you have lots of different people. They serve different purposes. You do different things with them. And, sometimes they come and sometimes they go. Oftentimes they're very long lasting, years. And so I think that's neat to be able to talk about it. This is my first time ever really hearing about it being done in this kind of way, and I think that's great.
It's interesting that what comes to mind, hearing you talk about the medical brain and hearing about the way that it felt like a really powerful way that friendship has showed up in your life. I can't remember where this was from, but there was someone who was saying that there's a metaphor of relationship as chemistry. Like you have an atom, there's a particular kind of other atom, they connect, and then like they're done. Like then they're together, and and it's big and it's energetic and it's fiery, right? And like it's kind of this it's like it can be expressed as a simple equation. And to me, the scientific metaphor of relationship is much more like ecology.
Okay.
It's much more like, okay, there's like my life is an ecosystem. There's all these things already in it. There's niches that are open in it. When I approach someone else, their ecosystem has stuff in it and has niches open in it. And how do we like fit into sort of niches in one another's life and then see what grows and see what evolves that fits the ecology we're in? And it's not as simple as like part A, like Adam A, Adam B, and
attraction. Yeah.
Right.
Which, by the way, is a lot. That metaphor is a lot like the kind of romantic, Jane Austen kind of metaphor, right? Like Mr. Darcy, there's just this attraction that can't be that can't be stopped, so to speak, by family, by circumstance, by whatever. And so I agree with you. Like my friendships, they're not whirlwind relationships. I've had sexual whirlwind in relationships, but my friendships are almost never like that. It's sort of this, maybe I'll invite, Stephen to this thing. I think he'll fit in, and I'm like, well, let's see how Stephen does.
And I have that too. I think the way I experience attraction is almost like I map out my own life. Like I go through this practice maybe once a year, right? I try to draw all the relationships that matter to me.
Okay.
And like what I do with them and note like, okay, what do I have? Like, where are the relationships that I'm doing something I want to do more of? Where are there gaps where I don't have a relationship but want a relationship? Like I try to get a mental picture of that. And then when I see someone and realize that they fit an openness that I have in my life, like that's the core of attraction to them. That's where I'm like, oh, like there's something about the way this person is that is a way that I want to be around that energy.
Yeah, that's me.
And I know exactly, and I know how to like approach them and confidently invite them into this niche in my life that is open and ready for someone like them. And it's not that, I want everything else to go away and them to be the only one that matters, but like there's a clear place and
you've got a plot of land that you can grow something. Yeah. I think that's cool. Now, it's so funny because, singles are better at doing this than partnered people typically. Like, so this sort of norm of that atomic bond in many ways works against couples, I think, because there's so much pressure on that relationship for them to be everything to each other that it can create distress rather than the fact that you might be willing and able to lean on other folks, same or opposite sex, whatever, it doesn't matter, in ways that are non-threatening to that relationship, and so I had Bella DePaulo on here. She does research on the science of single living. She says that married people have the one, single people have the ones, and that interconnection. That's good. So I want to step back for a second. So you not only you've become an activist. So at some point in your life, you recognized this about you and figured out the term was asexual, at least the way you would call it that. And then you ended up launching this website as a fairly young man, yes?
Yeah, when it's about 18.
Yes. But you don't just have a website. You have gone and now you do interviews. You're a feature of a documentary. You've done activist work. So how did that progress?
Yeah, so it really came from, I think my high school was really defined by my struggle with my aceness, because at that point I never talked to another person like me. Okay. I was pretty clear to me from middle school that sexuality was a thing that everyone around me was experiencing. I was expected to experience. It was kind of this essential part of growing up. And I was pretty fortunate in that I went to a high school. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. I went to a high school that had out queer kids.
I see. And
had popular out queer kids. So there was this sense that like there wasn't a sense that sexuality default meant straight, but it was default there. I see. And I really felt like, oh, if I'm not feeling this, I've got to be broken in some way. There's got to be something wrong with me. And it must mean that I can't really love people. It must mean that I'm defective and or I'm not capable of being loved. And it took me, I think, a lot of kind of personal struggle and support from friends to get to the point where I saw being asexual as okay. And I kind of made up the word for myself because I just wanted a way to talk about this experience. And I never talked to another person like me. And then when I went to undergrad, I knew enough web design that I kind of just put up a website to say like, hey, is there anyone else out there experiencing this? And I happened to put it up right around the time that Google went live.
Okay.
Dating myself. And it turns out, and this is why I don't say I invented the word asexual, it turns out that there were thousands and thousands of other people around the world who were going through the same struggle, who had independently invented the exact same term to describe it, and who then typed that term into Google.
Yeah,
and
that's great.
That is how, and like when you type that into Alta Vista and Yahoo and Lycos, you got like papers on plant biology. But when you typed into Google, you got my website. And so that became this kind of initial moment of us coming together that was incredibly powerful because all of us had struggled with a sense of feeling broken. All of us had like struggled with feeling like we were the only ones, and being able to just have the validation of other people who shared our experience was immensely powerful.
Yes.
And so I think I really became motivated in my activism, my community building by that experience, by the sense that there are people out there who are struggling with shame and struggling with the sense they're broken and wanting to create a way for them a way out of that feeling.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Talk about good timing.
Yeah. It's history is the history of the lucky.
Indeed, yes. Yeah, you can be too early, you can be too late. I can see how threatening that would be, even in a school that is, sort of more open than not, just again because you're not getting, almost nowhere else are you getting a positive message around being asexual. And that has to be super threatening that's there. Okay, so the website obviously started to grow in terms of users.
Mm-hmm.
But then how did you find yourself, like, you've been on The View, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
So this interest, started the website in 2001. In 2004, this study came out that was showed that 1% of people in the UK identified as asexual, or did not experience sexual attraction.
And this was like one question on a large sort of representative survey of the population that asked about sexual preferences, and there was an option that said, I'm not sexually attracted to men or women, or something like that. Was that?
Yeah, so I think it was a survey done in the UK, one of the largest surveys ever done on human sexual behavior, which asked about orientation as part of a battery of questions. And it said, are you primarily sexually attracted to men, women, men and women, or to no one at all?
Mm-hmm.
And there might have been another question. I think this was before they knew about gender non-binary folks in surveys. And so that was asked and was studied, and then a researcher from Canada went back and said, hey, well, the people who answered attracted to no one at all, like, what's up with them?
Yes.
Because this is a population that's never been talked about scientifically. So he released a paper analyzing this survey, and it came out right as our community was kind of hitting critical mass.
Okay.
And so there was this combination of, oh wow, here's this thing that seems impossible. Like who would have thought it was possible for humans to not be interested in sexuality? And here's this community of people who can talk about the human experience of it. And I was this founder who was at that point, early 20s, conventionally attractive, like white dude, mm-hmm. who was supposed to be at like the peak of my hormonal sexual journey. And so that, I think
you were camera ready.
I was camera ready, to a fault in a way that created some problems that I'll get to in a second. But I think that combination of the statistic and the community and me was really exciting. And so I kind of out of nowhere, I remember waking up, I was working on the 2004 election cycle, like 50 media requests from all over the UK, doing interviews on the radio on my phone. I flew out to the UK to be on television for it was in country for 12 hours. There was this huge wave of press that asexuality existed. Mm-hmm. And then that eventually crossed over to the US and sort of went from this wave of media surprise that we existed to media that was really trying to investigate what our experience was like, which is where the documentary that you saw came out of, which was incredibly well done.
Yeah. It is interesting. So, and then of course this perpetuates, because then what happens is, like, from my humor research, for example, my initial foray into it was a press release, mm-hmm. Tons of things. But then what ends up happening is you're putting out enough content, then you're contributing to media content. Then what happens is some journalist types in asexual or asexuality and something else, and then your name pops up. And so then it just starts then you become the person to call.
Yeah.
Which brings, obviously, that's how I found you.
Right.
And I watched your talk. I didn't care what you looked like, but I cared what you had to say, and so I was like, oh, this guy has his shit together. And you were kind enough to respond to my.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think I emailed the webmaster contact form on.
Yeah, which goes to me and goes to the rest of our web team.
I see. So you're yeah, and I think so. I have a previous episode on solo sex and evolution, and if I remember correctly, I could be wrong. Maybe I'm just making this up in my mind. So I had Marty Hazelton. She's an evolutionary psychologist. So I have to suspect around this time, evolutionary psychology was kind of popping onto the scene. Now, what's really fascinating about evolutionary psychology is what these researchers are doing is they're looking at behavior today, society and culture today, and how it's shaped through our ancestral past. Right, and the sort of story of evolution is mm-hmm. sex feels so good that we're compelled to do it, and as a benefit, we get these the benefit to humanity is we get these babies, right? As a mm-hmm. result of it, right? It perpetuates the species and so on. As an aside, I just read Robert Sapolsky's A Primate's Memoir, which is a really fantastic read, but it's funny watching him or reading about him watching the baboons and talking mm-hmm. about their sexual activity and it being connected, to these kind of concepts, right? Like this idea that maybe in some ways we're not so different than our primate, brothers, so to speak. But asexuality seems to be a real puzzle for that world of evolutionary psychologists.
Yes and no, because the mechanism is attraction, not arousal.
I see.
We haven't talked about this, but along with most aces, our body can still become aroused the way that any other person's can.
Okay.
The difference is that I don't have the same desire to engage in the activities that we would classify as sexual with someone that I'm emotionally intimate with.
Okay.
And I think this is where it's really important to kind of understand how much space there is between the protein encoding in DNA that says I have to engage in a really complicated set of puppetry to get into another set of DNA in another person,
yes.
Right? And that involves a whole, but it's operating at the level of what proteins do I encode? It's pretty far removed from the, I think, frankly, pretty largely socially constructed category of sexuality.
Yeah.
Okay. We call some things sexual, we call other things not sexual, we call some forms of pleasure sexual, other forms of pleasure non-sexual, we call some relationships sexual, other forms not sexual. We call some people, we make up genders. And we're attracted to those genders, and we're attracted to particular pieces of clothing that a gender might wear, and that's got nothing to do with the way that our proteins are encoded, or it's very far removed from the way our proteins are encoded. And so I would say that I still have this deep desire to connect with people. I still mm-hmm. I still personally have a desire for touch with people. I still have pretty much all the things that my proteins are encoding me to do. And I still have a desire to have kids, which I have, you have
kids.
I have a kid who's not genetically related to me, but who is legally I'm a parent of. And so I think that it's a vast oversimplification to imagine that from the standpoint of a strand of DNA, what is wanted is sex, or what is wanted is something like a social construction of heteronormativity.
Okay, I'll try to put this in my own language, which is, let's take our baboon brothers, right? They have sex, they have babies, right? You know what I mean? And it follows a particular pattern with regard to hierarchies and, the likelihood that the female can get pregnant and when they're most attractive and all these kinds of things, right? And it's sort of this pretty simple-ish script. When it comes to...
I question how simple it really is, but keep going.
I'm saying relative to the human one, to Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
So the parallel to that in my world, the world of humor, is the things that make baboons laugh is rather limited, right? It's like play fighting and tickling and physical comedy type stuff, right? Then what ends up happening, though, when you add all this other stuff, language, norms, culture, etc., the things that can create laughter become, limitless, right? Now you have wordplay, you have satire, you have irony, you have all this kind of stuff. You have rom-coms, and so on. In the same way that the things that can be sexualized, arousing, exciting, and so on can start to go beyond just climb aboard. You know what I mean? And so I understand, my point is, I think what we're talking about, I'm thinking about it in a slightly different way, but the complexities start to become, as I said, limitless, right?
Yeah, and I also would say, and I've seen very limited research about this, but it is not uncommon for something like aceness to exist in the animal world.
I'm not surprised to hear that.
Right?
I am not surprised.
It is not, and there is, and when I think about like a baboon society or a bonobo society, there's a lot of kinds of intimacy going on there, right? And we as humans take the word sexuality and we apply them to some things those bonobos or those primates do, but they don't have that word. They don't make that distinction. And their lived experience of doing a sexual thing versus doing a thing that we deem non-sexual may not be that different. And so I think that's part of how I tend to want to blow up the category of sexuality into the larger category of intimacy, to blow up the category of sexuality into the larger category of touch, in part because that makes room for me, but also because I think it can be helpful to say what happens if we think about this bigger range of human activity instead of this narrow one that tends to have a lot of scripts put up in it.
I agree with that. I like that a lot. And by the way, in that book, it was interesting the way Sapolsky talked about grooming and all these other things and these connections, these pairings that would happen that were intimate even if they weren't really sexual. Yeah, I always think about this, this is about sex and love. They can be connected, but they can also be independent. That they don't have to go hand in hand as the normal kind of Cinderella script tends to, be played out. So I want to ask you a few questions about. One is when I learned about asexuality, I was not at all surprised by it. So as a scientist, I tend to think there so many things exist in this sort of normal distribution. My first semester in graduate school, I'm taking these hardcore statistics courses, which are talking about normal distributions, and that there are, yes, maybe most people sit close to the middle, but as you get out on the tails, you have people very high and very low on whatever dimension that it is, and I mean, what I know about sexuality, I know that there are people who are way out on one tail. It's not surprising that there might be people way out on the other tail. So to me, that's not surprising. What's surprising is, of course, that it's not being talked about, covered in the sciences and beyond until rather recently. One of the things I had mentioned pride earlier, and so within the gay and lesbian community, the rainbow flag as being sort of a symbol of pride. There's kind of a pride symbol for the ace community too. Yes.
There's a few of them. So it used to be a slice of cake. Now
Okay.
we have our own flag. Now it's purple, white, gray, and black.
Okay.
But which is also a great color scheme, I think. But it used to be a slice of cake, and the reason is that anyway, like if you went to an ace meetup, there'd be cake getting served. Like people made earrings, little cake on them.
I see.
And the reason is that remember how I said that in the early days of the community, there was this huge sense of validation when someone arrived and realized they weren't alone.
Okay.
So people, when they would show up on the website on asexuality.org and kind of post their stories and say, here's what I've been struggling with my entire life, and can people relate to this? People would respond with a little emoji of a slice of cake.
I see. That's lovely.
And say, well, you're welcome here. And so that became the symbol of welcome, that became a symbol of the ace community.
But why the cake?
It started, why any internet meme, right? It just started. It's a thing people did. But I think the symbolism of it is powerful because a cake is a dish almost exclusively for celebration and community.
I see. Okay, that's great. So another thing, and this again, I think connects to the queer community a lot, is this notion of coming out as asexual. I think that was in the documentary. That this can be a rather sort of important moment for an ace member.
So I think this is something that we think about, talk about. It's shifted a lot over the years. In the early days, compared to my gay friends who were coming out, like they could come out and say, I'm gay, and I had to come out and kind of give a 40-minute lecture.
Yeah, right.
Because no one knew what this thing was. I even had a lot of questions. It broke everyone's assumptions about how humans work and how sexuality works, and I had to deal with that. And so there were times when I just stopped coming out because I didn't want to be educating all the time. Now things are better. Now, especially within, I think, younger culture, there's pretty widespread understanding in many parts of the world about aceness, and so people can kind of talk about it more casually. And I think there's also beginning to be a better understanding about ace intimacy. For a long time, coming out meant there's this real fear that you're going to torpedo any potential relationships you might form, especially for romantic people. And now I think we're beginning to get to a place where that's still a fear, but there's more of an understanding of what are the possibilities of ace intimacy, what are the possibilities of ace romantic intimacy, both with other aces and with non-aces, and people are exploring that.
Yeah, okay, I could see that. So the other one is, and this is, I remember, I'm actually curious, sort of, you're the second most famous asexual person that I know of.
Uh-oh. No, I don't know. I don't know if I can count as number two, but
you probably don't. But that just shows you the lack of kind of conversation that exists in the world. And that person, and maybe I may even misremembering this. That person is Janine Garofalo.
Oh, I was like, are you going to say Tim Gunn or Morrissey?
Oh yes, Morrissey is another one. Yes, that's right. But
so Janine Garofalo has used the word asexual in comedy sketches.
Yeah. So
there's this interesting phenomenon where within the community, we use the word asexual a particular way. There's a definition. We have a shared understanding of what it means. When I or most people in our community use the word, it kind of we're under the same umbrella. When Morrissey used it, it was before the community existed. So,
and for the listener, Morrissey is he's a musician from 80s, 90s.
Yeah.
Very sort of sad, dark music. It was the Smiths, right? He was the lead singer for the Smiths.
Lead singer of the Smiths.
Yeah.
When Janine Garofalo uses it, and I haven't looked at this too much because I'm not into ace celebrityness.
Okay.
When Jean Garofalo uses it, it's unclear if that's because she has like seen our community, seen our definition, and is embracing this as like naming this as an orientation.
Okay.
If this is if it's kind of like a bit in like that she wants it to play out. If this is her describing an experience about she's having at a particular time in her life, but she doesn't mean it in the way that I would mean it as something like an orientation, all of which are valid uses. I don't want to kind of own the single definition of the word, but I also don't want to claim that my experience maps onto her experience or Morrissey's experience because I don't know what's behind their choice of word.
Yeah, I get it. That's fine. I just was, when I was contemplating doing this, I remembered, I mean, obviously I pay more attention to comedy.
Right.
And I like my music a little more upbeat than Morrissey's music, although he has a song that I quite liked called "The More You Ignore Me, the Closer I Get." It's a super catchy, very Morrissey song. I'll put it in the exhibits. Any case.
Yeah, but the ace historian analysts in our community are like curious about Tesla, curious about Newton, curious. There's a whole number of historical figures who could be read as ace.
Yeah.
But I think it can be dangerous to try to do that too aggressively.
I know, I went down this path at one point in time because I was looking for sort of notable solos through history. The problem, I actually stopped doing it. It's a fairly impossible task, in part because getting married was such the norm.
Yeah.
That the person who didn't want to get married still got married. Like Abe Lincoln,
right?
Still gets married even though he really didn't want to be married.
Right.
And and then also there's people who are solo, but maybe like Da Vinci, for example. Right? There's all these debates about Da Vinci's sexual orientation, and that maybe that's why he didn't get married. Like, it's not a useful exercise because the world was such a different and frankly unfair, unwelcoming place if you wanted something different than that.
And I think that to me that's how I don't know if you're familiar with the term Boston marriage.
I'm not familiar.
If that's come up in your... So there were women who would sort of defy the mandate that they needed to get married by moving in with one another and living their entire lives together, or living huge chunks of their lives together. And this can be read, depending on how you read it, as a solo ace or lesbian act. Right?
Yes.
And probably it's a mix of all of those things.
Yes.
But importantly, I think it's sort of a moment of resistance. It's a moment of possibility outside of this imperative, this kind of heteronormative romantic imperative. And that's the interesting thing. It's not like we're these people feeling my body feelings or your body feelings in this moment. It's in history. It's like there's a lineage to, I think, a lot of the struggle that I've had in my life around shame about not being sexual enough, not being partnered in the right ways. And it's good to know the history of that.
I agree. So this morning, there's this used bookstore here close to me that has like very limited hours, and I've been frequenting it a lot. And because it's like this, it's like the cheapest bookstore I've ever been to. So I just roll the dice on lots and lots of books. Mm. So one of the books that I picked off the shelf, which is not a book I would ever have read if I wasn't doing this project, is Elizabeth Gilbert wrote a book called Committed. So Elizabeth Gilbert wrote Eat, Pray, Love, super famous, made her a famous author. She wrote a book. So at the end of Eat, Pray, Love, she meets this man that she falls for. He's like a Brazilian man of Australian nationality or whatever. Mm-hmm. And they're having a relationship. And then at some point in time, he's trying to come into the country with her, and he's stopped at the border and not allowed to come in. Mm-hmm. And the book is basically the process of her becoming committed. Quote, I'm doing air quotes as I say this to you. They have to get married in order for them to continue their relationship. and the book is basically about that experience, about her, taking a look at marriage through this lens of needing to get married in order to be able to still be with this man, at least in this part of the world, so to speak. Of course, I Googled it. After I finished the book, I Googled it. They're no longer together anymore anyways, kind of a thing. But it's just, what did you call it, a heteroromantic?
I think the word I've been throwing around, which is a queer theory word, is heteronormative.
Heteronormative, yeah. Heteronormative. Yeah, so I don't know. It's just fascinating, again, how, I was thinking about that, and, it's easy to kind of make fun of Elizabeth Gilbert, but you think about it as that's the only way she's able to continue this relationship in the United States, and how limiting that is for, you know what I mean? For example, if you don't want to marry the person, you know what I mean? Or at a period of time where you couldn't marry the person, and so on, that this standard still is so strong. It's the 800-pound gorilla, to continue with our primate conversation.
It reminds me of when I was going through the process of adopting my daughter and interacting with family court, recognizing how, I'm someone who has a pretty significant amount of privilege in the world. I'm relatively well off. I work in tech. I'm white. I'm cis. I'm male. And
you live in a place that's more accepting than most other places.
True, of queerness.
Yes.
And in San Francisco and California. And I remember seeing, here I am interacting with kind of the legal infrastructure of family. And it's kind of set up, we think about these stories of family, we think about these scripts of relationship, and they're sort of set up for people in positions of privilege. And for a lot of folks, who are trying to navigate the immigration system, who have loved ones for reasons legitimate or not in prison, these scripts become as much about how you interact with the state and how you signal to the state that your relationship is worth respecting, as they are about the norms of how you date and how you think about intimacy. And it becomes an institutional performance.
Yes, indeed.
And I think that's important to recognize too when talking about it.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a couple more quick things for you. So I feel like the listeners' heads might be swimming a little bit when it comes to terminology.
Yeah.
So if I could, I'm going to ask you to go through and redefine some of these terms, these concepts. I'm also going to ask about a couple other I stumbled over, and you can feel free to dismiss them if they're not relevant. This notion of tadpoles and amoebas.
So
and so on. So can we go through and kind of just about asexuality being aromantic, and so on, demisexual, and so on.
Do a definition hour. Okay, I will try to tell a story that hits all the words.
That's perfect. That's great. And maybe
stories are a good way to make sense of things.
And I think we can end on that, so you can get back to your parenting.
Sounds great.
Okay.
So let's go back to, when I'm in high school, I'm one of the several thousand people who've invented this word and who are looking for one another. Mm-hmm. We type in the word asexual to the search engines that existed at the time, where we get our papers about amoebas.
Okay, right.
And papers about plant biology. And so one of the first, I wasn't actually the first community-based people. I was one of the first, but the first one was called the Haven for the Human Amoeba. It was a Yahoo group with 18 people on it. The phrase human amoeba got thrown around almost as a joke, because that's what people were finding was.
I see. That's really
stuff about amoebas. And then I start my site, asexuality.org, with the word asexual. That resonates with people. That seems to be what people are inventing and typing in. I think it's a good word. It's not a great word because it's a negative, not a positive definition. It's defining what we're not, rather than defining the shared experience we have, which I would say is one of breaking out of sexual scripts, breaking out of the expectations of sexual scripts, and figuring out how to do that.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that, because I, especially as a young man, I can only now reflect on this, how trapped I felt by my sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Like what a overwhelming burden it was on me in terms of wanting this thing, sex with women, and being unfulfilled in that way.
Yeah, I don't know what that's like.
And how it, like, honestly, like, those motivations crowded out a lot of other very healthy, engaging, interesting thoughts, activities, experiences that I could have had. And so I like the idea that breaking free of that has a positive element to it.
Yeah. Yes, and I contrast that with the image of me in high school.
Okay.
Is I have a friend. A lot of my friends were female. Some were male. Some were queer. Some weren't. I have a friend, and what we do is we get on the phone and talk for hours, and they talk about whatever relationship crush they're currently trying to process.
Okay.
And I talk about, like, the nature of what is sexuality.
Fair enough. That's fair.
And it wasn't that, like, they had this burden of desire that I didn't have. It was that they were, I was just as confused about how to connect emotionally with people, about, like, what does it mean to want to touch people if I don't want that to happen sexually? How do I express that desire? How do I, like I was just as confused and torn up and, awkward about all that stuff as my sexual friends were about the sexual stuff. It's not like I got off.
No, that's fair, but I
easy, but
no, I'm not. But I'm saying is that there is some positive element to that release of that.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think the thing that I ultimately, and I think I had to let go of and mourn this, but to be free of the sense that if I'm not sexual in the right way, if I'm not romantic in the right way, I will never be happy.
Yeah, that's right. I think I get, and in the same way that I completely understand that feeling. In terms of, there's something that's different about me, and will this difference be bad for me? Yeah, that's concerned. Okay, so you were saying asexual's good enough, right? That's where you were saying, like, it describes this thing.
So the word asexual became like this this flag for everyone to rally around. And the thing we started saying pretty early on in the community is the word asexual is a tool and not a label.
Okay.
If it helps you understand yourself, if it helps you describe yourself to others, pick it up and use it. If you pick it up and use it and it's like a little awkward in your hand and you want to change it to make it fit you better, do that. Like, it does need to mean the same thing for every person. It needs to be for every person. If it ever makes sense to put it down, put it down. And I think one of the things that was, I think, really amazing about our community is that we had people who identified as asexual for a period of time, then stopped using the term, and still stayed on as leaders in the community.
Okay.
Like, you weren't kind of ostracized for that. And, that wasn't the norm, but that happens. It does in all forms of fluid sexuality. And so then you had these people identifying as asexual, experimenting with it, modifying the term, and other words started coming out of that experimentation as people came to the community and said, I resonate with what you're saying. I still experience some sexuality, just not as much as everyone else around me. Uh-huh. And people started identifying as gray A because they were kind of on the spectrum between sexual and asexual.
Okay.
There were people who came and said, you know what, I realized that for most of my life, I identify, like, I feel asexual, but when I get in a really deep relationship with someone, sometimes I'm open to sexuality. Like, sometimes it starts to be appealing to me, but I can't do the thing that society wants me to do, which is, like, go on a date with someone and know if I'm sexually attracted to them from moment one, right? Like, and so they started identifying as demisexual. And we had all of these terms emerging for kind of where people fell on a spectrum of sexuality. Asexual, gray A, demisexual, and the word ace became an umbrella term.
I see.
To refer to the community holistically. And then similarly, as Evan was talking about sexual orientation, people also started talking about romantic orientation. Some people still had crushes, they still wanted to date, they still had a real strong desire for romantic relationships, other people like me didn't. And so people started identifying as homoromantic, panromantic, biromantic, heteromantic, aromantic. And the now in the community, many times people will often name themselves as having a sexual orientation and a romantic orientation.
I see. Yeah, they go. I can see why that you need both of those.
Yeah.
Right. I see.
And people quickly went on to like create n-dimensional hypercubes to describe.
Of course, yeah.
Like,
of course.
like we didn't stop at just those two spectra, but those are the two that really stuck.
Yeah, I see. Wait, one last thing about it. But why did I write down tadpoles?
I have no idea why you wrote down tadpoles.
No problem. That's okay. Good. We'll just forget I asked that. So, David, thank you so much for your time. I think what you're doing is really, really wonderful and obviously incredibly important. And I just appreciate your generosity and willingness to talk to someone who is eager to learn and eager to support, but didn't know much to begin with. So I'm very thankful.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a really fun conversation.
Great. Okay. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable